Yeah. So hi everyone, welcome to another session of the Global Pakistan Tech Summit. As you know, this is a month-long virtual conference, and today we are at day 26 with more than 200,000 uh, people reached, more than 70,000 views, and a lot of people impacted. We have around 250 speakers, out of which half of them are women leaders, which is our commitment to promoting women leaders this month as startup grind, but also as at a work at Ijad Labs. So again, I'm Arda Shazan. I run Startup Grind in Pakistan, and I run Ijad Labs. It is my pleasure to host today's session because ecosystem building is something that we've been doing for the past 3-4 years in Pakistan. But there are wonderful organizations who are doing this not just for one country but for kind of the whole world, right? And 500 Startups happens to be one of these organizations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the two speakers that we have today. So number one, we have Thomas Jeng, who leads 500 Startups ecosystems team in the Asia Pacific, kind of overseeing collaborations with governments, with large enterprises throughout this region. His roles takes him from San Francisco to Japan and Australia, as well as everything in between. Previously, Thomas was the co-founder and CEO of Junction. He started his career in strategy consulting at the Boston Consulting Group and Gartner. Thomas holds a degree from Georgetown University and the Yale School of Management. Thank you for joining us, Thomas.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So now towards our next speaker. So Fadwa leads 500 Startups implementation team globally. She's responsible for the setup and execution of 500 Startups founder-facing programs outside the US. She has overseen programs in Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and supported teams in Japan, Russia, and Singapore. In her role, she has worked with diverse founders across multiple industries. She holds a degree in international relations from modern Middle East studies, international relations and modern Middle East studies from the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with our round of questions and the classic fireside chat that we host. And I'll start with the first question, which is a lot of people might not know about 500 Startups, so they should know. Everyone should know. But for those of our audience who don't know this amazing organization, if you can kind of give a brief introduction of what 500 Startups does and how it kind of started.
Sure, absolutely. So 500 is above all, a global ecosystem builder. And in service of supporting startup founders throughout the world, we conduct a number of different activities. So first, we are a venture investor. And in fact, we are generally the most active early stage investor throughout the world. We now have 2,500 different portfolio companies across 75 different countries. We tend to invest at the seed stage, sometimes before it, frequently after it as well. We also run startup programs throughout the world. We were actually one of the first startup accelerators founded in the Bay Area and have started to carry that cultivation of talent and of support for founders throughout the world. As you can hear from Fadwa's bio in particular, we've gone from San Francisco to Japan, to Russia, to Saudi Arabia, and even further than that. So all of these things we do in really the interest of supporting entrepreneurs across every aspect of what they need in order to be successful.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. And I've personally, I think I have some friends who've been through 500 Startups, and I've seen your demo day, one of the demo days in San Francisco. This was last year when physical demo days were a thing. And with this, I'll come to my next question. That I consider myself an ecosystem builder. We've done a lot of things. So, from your perspective, if you can kind of tell us, how do you define an ecosystem? And you're doing this around the world, right? So, why do you think ecosystem development is important?
Yeah. So first of all, we fundamentally believe and we hold in the mission of our company that entrepreneurship can uplift people and uplift economies. And in many ways, the growth, the advancement, the progress that results from entrepreneurship is the lifeblood of societies and communities throughout the world. It's what really helps us move forward. It's what helps everyone live a more abundant and more prosperous life. And so as we think about building ecosystems, we recognize that across many different countries, many different cities, communities, what have you, a lot of the entrepreneurs that are in place don't necessarily have the same access to expertise, to talent, to capital, to other types of connections that many of their fellows in the Bay Area do. Silicon Valley and the broader San Francisco Bay Area have just the highest density really possible in the world of all of these different things. But from our very inception, we believe that it was our mission to bring these things to other economies and also help these ecosystems take root in their own way across different geographies as well. So when we look at it, an ecosystem, it really consists of many, many different things. You have, first and foremost, the entrepreneurs, of course. They themselves are the driving force of any startup ecosystem. Beyond that, you have investors. You have other sources of capital. You have the talent that help power these startups. You have technologies produced by universities and other players within the ecosystem as well. And very crucially, I think they're emerging as a major player in these ecosystems as corporations and SMEs, as well as individual consumers who provide the demand for the services and for the products that these startups provide. And so I'm leaving out a lot of different things, but we really look at ecosystems as the totality of the different players that make up the fabric of everything that surrounds a startup.
Well, thank you so much for giving this comprehensive description of what this means. I'll go a little bit off script and maybe ask this question. You're based currently in San Francisco. What do you think kind of differentiates Silicon Valley from around the world? And I know a lot of people might have different perspectives, but I just want to get like a perspective for our audience that what does it mean to be in Silicon Valley, and what are like those things that other ecosystems miss?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's one that's brought up quite a bit. I'll also ask Fadwa to jump in here later. Neither she nor I are actually Bay Area natives, and so we have a little bit more of a comparative perspective. So I think what really stands out for me is the history of Silicon Valley itself. At the time when Silicon Valley really started booming, it was in the post-World War II era in the United States. And it was a time when a lot of the research that had come out of the military efforts and elsewhere had started to take root and were starting to be commercialized in a very serious way. And what was also interesting at the time for me, having spent a lot of time on the East Coast of the US as well, is that Silicon Valley sat geographically and from in terms of information, in terms of power structures, is pretty far away from the institutions that already existed on the East Coast. And so fundamentally speaking, there wasn't really the same incentive or the same even ability to build upon what was already there before. Much of the time they were having to build new. Around the time of the boom of Silicon Valley, between the 50s and the 80s in particular, if you went to Silicon Valley, it'd be a bunch of fruit orchards. There was a lot of farmland in the area still. And so you didn't have the same cities, you didn't have the same banks, you didn't have the same companies, major conglomerates that you did back east. And so what you had was a community of people who were building new companies, building new products, leveraging new technologies on a consistent basis, and always feeding that back into the next generation of entrepreneurs. You can talk about differences in policy environments and all of those things, but fundamentally speaking, for me, the founding ethos of Silicon Valley is to always build new. And one observation I have is that there's nothing to replace. There's nothing to really stop you from building new. There's no one with an incentive to block that. And so that gave a lot of freedom and a lot of opportunity to the people who were seeking to do new and innovative things. And that's, in my view, at least at the time, what set Silicon Valley apart from almost every other ecosystem in the world.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for giving that introduction. And we believe this kind of concentration of talent still really helps Silicon Valley stay ahead of everything in the world. With this, I'll just come to my next question, and whoever of you whichever of you wants to answer this. So, how does 500 startups conduct ecosystem development?
Fadwa, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I think what Thomas described in terms of the ecosystem being a sum of the parts is really the key. When 500 startups kind of gets involved in an ecosystem, it's not just supporting founders. Especially in our early days, we supported a lot of founders through our San Francisco Accelerator, who we thought were amazing, had come from all over the world, came to San Francisco, went through the accelerator. We were sure they were set up for success. They returned to their home ecosystems or their home countries, and 6 months, a year, 2 years out, they were struggling or failing. And so we had to take a hard look at why, because we had seen them up close, personal, worked with them for a period of 4 months, and we were very confident in these companies. But we looked at where the environment they were returning to, and very often entrepreneurship was not a norm. As Thomas mentioned, policy regulations maybe were not very favorable. And so this kind of spurred 500 to get involved in ecosystems outside of Silicon Valley, because we had a vested interest in companies surviving and thriving in our portfolio and beyond, because a healthy ecosystem is kind of composed of multiple startups, investors, governments, corporates, everybody kind of working together. And so I think a lot of the work that 500 does is bringing all of those stakeholders together to support those founders to ensure that they are able to grow and thrive.
Perfect, perfect. No, thank you for outlining this. And I think some of our work has also been to locally at least bring these stakeholders together. I'll come to my next question, which is, what sort of programs do you run for startups?
Sure. Yeah. So we work predominantly with pre-seed, seed stage startups. And in those cases, you're looking mostly at startup accelerators or boot camps. Boot camps are kind of shorter, maybe more focused programs that focus on a specific kind of tool that a startup founder will need to be successful, whether it's marketing or sales, fundraising, pitching, and also kind of just laying the foundations. An accelerator is kind of a longer term program where we work with the founders across those topics over several weeks, running experiments, helping them to kind of test the frameworks that we teach them with their customers in their markets, and then learning from the results and then continuing to build and grow. We also work with later stage companies, so Series A, post seed, usually in growth programs. So those will be kind of shorter, more intense programs where we're really focusing on experimentation and growth at that point. The seed stage is really about laying the foundation, making sure that you have sound practices. And then when we look at kind of Series A, you're really hoping to build towards exponential growth, which investors obviously love to see, and that really indicates kind of a good health for a tech startup. So we work more on scaling at the Series A stage.
I think it's worth noting as well that our ecosystems programs extend beyond interacting directly with startups as well. And going back to Fadwa's point, I think we recognize for a lot of the more nascent ecosystems that were out there, there just were fewer opportunities for entrepreneurs because the capital wasn't there, the sophistication of investors wasn't there, the customer base often wasn't there either. And so, especially over the past few years, we've started to emphasize our interaction with other stakeholders in ecosystems, namely individual investors, fund managers, family offices, as well as large corporations. And so on the investor side, we also run investor education programs throughout the world. For example, we have run one together with a foundation in Saudi Arabia to educate local ecosystem builders as well as startup investors. On a normal basis, we also have partnerships with Stanford, with Berkeley, and with INSEAD to run similar programs throughout the world. With corporations in particular, we have seen that there's an increasing confluence of interest between startups and corporations. Corporations are often looking for innovation. They're looking to avoid disruption. They're looking for their next source of growth. And startups themselves are looking for the next customer, or they're looking for a partner that can help them get distribution or support with R&D in many cases. These two sides often struggle to work together with each other well. They are just fundamentally set up as different organizations with different speeds, different processes, even different mindsets. And so a lot of what we've spent time in the last few years doing is starting to bridge that gap between these two types of companies as well. And so our team actually spends quite a bit of time working with corporations to help them create startup programs, figure out their internal processes and how to work with startups, even figure out their innovation strategy. And that started to bear fruit as they and startups are able to work together more effectively to mutual benefit.
Well, that's perfect, and I would totally agree that we've seen that there are major family businesses in Pakistan or major corporations. So it's a country of 200 million. There are very, very large businesses that require digital transformation. And a lot of the times, the challenges that these startups face could be very easily solved by partnering up with one of these large corporations, right? And as you said, rightfully said, when it comes to distribution or maybe reach or maybe kind of going to market if it's an enterprise product, right? So with this, I'd like to uh, kind of ask in more detail about one of the programs that you mentioned. So you mentioned about the investor education program, right? And you've obviously run these in other ecosystems. So what I would ask, I'm asking this for this particular ecosystem, what does the investor education program mean? And how can it particularly help a growing ecosystem where there are not a lot of angel investors or not a lot of traditional VCs?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And the shortage of capital and the shortage of investors is often one of the top complaints of startup founders, really no matter where we go, except for potentially Silicon Valley. But even there, startups still complain about access to capital. So I think it's just a very, very top priority for founders, and it's one that we are trying to help address. So taking a step back, when it comes to venture capital and startup investments, I think for those of us that are active in the ecosystem, it's often easy to lose sight that what we're doing is not well understood by a lot of people. And from a number of perspectives, the asset class of equity in startups is a very exotic one. Even within the broader sphere of alternative assets, it's actually a very, very small proportion of total capital that's committed from an investment landscape perspective. And so I think most people look at venture capital as a subset of private equity. The totality of private equity is probably like 90 to 100 times bigger than venture capital itself. It's a very small proportion, I think in the single digits of percentages. And so just as an asset class, again, it's not very well understood. It's not very well appreciated. And one of the challenges that startup founders face when they're raising capital outside of highly dense ecosystems with experienced investors is that investors usually try to apply their existing investment logic to their investments in startups. And so that may mean taking an overly high proportion of equity. That may mean valuations based on predicted cash flows, which, of course, especially at the early stage of startups, are nearly impossible to predict accurately. You have investors that are imposing terms that may make it difficult for startups to raise a subsequent round, which means that really everyone loses because the investor can't find an exit, the startup doesn't grow, and they don't find the right amount of capital to foster their scaling. And so in the interest of solving these issues, we essentially focus on helping investors understand, first and foremost, the dynamics of startups, and then therefore extending from that, the dynamics of startup investing. And what is the logic of the different series involved, what you should expect at different rounds, and crucially for investors, how to invest or how to assess the quality of investment in a startup. And we spend a lot of time helping our class participants work through case studies, work through frameworks that allow them to understand in a more comprehensive way how to evaluate whether or not a startup is worth investing in, and then how to value them. We then go through some of the legal terms, especially in the US context, of how to create a term sheet and how to create an investment contract with those startups. And so that tends to form the core of what we do in terms of investor education. We have a couple of more specialized programs as well. We have what we call the Bootcamp for Accelerator Managers. This is a program directed specifically towards ecosystem builders like yourself, who are running incubators, accelerators, startup boot camps, startup formation programs throughout the world, helping them figure out their value proposition, helping them benefit from the programmatic experience that we have. We also run what we call Deal Camp, which is actually oriented more towards the technical side of startup term sheets, which we do in partnership with the Berkeley Law School. And that is geared towards supporting investors in getting very, very in depth on the terms and the legal contracting with startups involved.
I would also add that kind of 500, we really recognize that venture is not a zero-sum game. So the more investors that are out there in the world that are kind of informed and know about venture and are looking at startups with a critical eye, the better for every ecosystem, and the better for, even selfishly a little bit, for us. And so we really do kind of open our playbooks. It's a very much like, this is 500, how we invest, this is our investment thesis, this is how you can craft an investment thesis. So as Thomas mentioned briefly, we did run this course in Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi, you have a lot, I think similar to Pakistan, you have a lot of family offices. And so you have a younger generation of family members that are kind of coming up in the family and are interested in diversifying away from real estate or traditional investments. And so they're looking at venture as kind of an opportunity to take some initiative in the family and kind of look at a new asset class. And so that was a very interesting aspect of the course in Saudi Arabia, whereas when we run it in Silicon Valley, very often you have kind of investors that are a little bit more savvy in terms of what venture is, and they're not coming at it from a complete unknown. But for this program, we really did work on kind of training what venture is and how to set up your own fund.
No, that's fantastic, and thank you so much for sharing all these details about this program. I particularly asked, as you mentioned, Father, because Pakistan has a lot of family businesses, and although some of them have really gone big on investing in startups, like this Fatma Group, there's Lexin Group, some of they happen to our friends as well, but there are still more businesses and enterprises and even corporations who have a lot of cash to spend, who are looking for opportunities, but maybe they don't have enough understanding, or they don't have enough comfort investing in technology companies or startups, right? And we're definitely looking forward to exploring this program, especially for the Pakistani market and our community here. I'll come to the next question, which is, you talked about all these specific programs which were for startups. How do startups get into 500 Startups different programs?
Well, there's a number of paths. I'll defer to Fado since she can talk through the specific mechanics of what we're looking for.
Yeah, so I think the big news this year with 500 Startups is our San Francisco Accelerator is moving towards a rolling admissions virtual model. So that means in the past, we used to have two concrete kind of encapsulated batches a year. So you had a start date and an end date. Applications opened on a certain date, closed on a certain date. We selected the startups and they graduated. And it was very defined. But we found that necessarily doesn't work for all founders, right? They may not be ready right then when applications open, but a month or two later they are and they want to get in, but now there's not another application round for 4 months. And additionally, as we've kind of seen with COVID, and virtual programming is needed, and it also allows us to access regions and founders that maybe aren't able to travel to San Francisco for 4 months at a time. And so startups can apply year-round to the San Francisco Accelerator, Our San Francisco Accelerator is kind of looking at seed stage, pre-seed, seed stage startups, because 500 is typically the first institutional investment that these founders receive investment from. Typically, they're coming with either angel investment, or they've bootstrapped, or maybe raised from friends and family. And so we look for product market fit. We're really a growth accelerator. So if you're pre-product or you're pre-market fit and you haven't really found traction yet, we're probably looking for a little bit later on in your life cycle, when you're starting to have customers and maybe generating a little bit of revenue or interest in terms of partnerships or other sorts of traction that you can demonstrate there's a need for your product. And then there's an application, and we review every single application. And at any given time, there's like 2,000 sitting in the pipeline. And then for those that kind of fit the first pass, we then conduct interviews, and we raise them to our investment committee to determine if we're going to pursue the investment. However, we also run global programs. So throughout the year, at any given time, for example, currently there's a program going on in Tbilisi, Georgia, where we're working with the Bank of Georgia and the World Bank and GITA to run a program specifically focused on startups interested in operating in Georgia, already in Georgia. And so at any given time, 500 has applications. Right now, actually, there's an application open for our program in Kobe City, Japan. We're going to be running a COVID-focused accelerator, so startups addressing kind of current, so healthcare kind of challenges that we're looking at, and also post-COVID. So what does remote life and kind of regular life look like after this? And so startups can apply to these programs, and they're usually on our website, and we release announcements on our Twitter, as well as LinkedIn. And so founders can always check those outlets to see what applications are open, and we're always excited to receive interest.
So also to add on to what Fadwa has mentioned, in the interest of opening up our playbook, it's helpful to know what we as program managers and we as investors are looking for when we're investing or when we're assessing startups that have applied to our programs. Because ultimately we are not only an ecosystem builder, we also run venture funds, and we are looking for top tier investments to the extent possible. And so we usually look at the 6 T's when it comes to evaluating startups. And I'm probably going to forget at least one of these, so please bear with me. But the number one for early stage startups tends to be team. In other words, how skilled is this team? How gritty is this team? How persistent are you likely to be? The second is what we call TAM, or the total addressable market. Do we believe that there is a significant market, usually on the scale of at least $1 billion, for you to scale into? And this can be defined in a number of different ways, but usually we are looking for something that will allow for significant uptake throughout the world. We are looking for technology. We are, ideally there's something innovative or novel about your approach. It doesn't necessarily have to be, deep fundamental technology, but some combination of things that makes it a little bit different. The fourth is traction. In other words, how much purchase or how much uptake are you getting from your users? What is the market's response to you so far? Quite candidly, especially among early stage startups, that can be difficult to address because you're just starting out. And so that tends to be a little less important, but becomes more important over time as your company matures. The fifth one is trends, which is, do we believe that what you're doing is consistent with the overall direction of the market, with technologies, with consumer behavior? And the sixth is terms, or in other words, under what terms are we investing? What does your cap table look like? What does your current setup with existing investors look like? Do we believe that there's an opportunity for an exit down the road? For our accelerator in San Francisco, we offer set terms. It's $150,000 in exchange for 6% of equity. But our ability to deploy that also does somewhat depend on your existing capital structure and how ownership is set up among different co-founders and others who may have been investors already. So as you start to pitch 500, as you apply to us, it's imperative to keep these things in mind So you can essentially give us what we're looking for. And that makes the conversation much, much easier down the line when you're invited in for an interview or for a further conversation about whether or not to join the program.
Yeah, fantastic, and thank you so much for sharing the metrics on which you kind of see a startup or gauge whether that's good enough to get in. I think a lot of startups will find this very helpful, and I think it's a great opportunity that all of these programs are kind of running virtually right now. So there's no restriction that you will need to go to center school later, which obviously has its own value. But I think it's an opportunity that startups can apply for all these programs, whether they're in Japan or elsewhere, if they are taking applications virtually and globally. Uh, I'll come to my next question, which is, so what suggestions do you have for people trying to build local ecosystems? So essentially, people like me.
Yeah. So I think the number one tip is to not try to be like Silicon Valley. I think for various historical reasons and for various institutional reasons, it's really not possible. New York isn't going to be like Silicon Valley. Karachi isn't going to be like Silicon Valley. I think when I think about the successful ecosystems, or I should say the ecosystem builders who've been successful in driving impact in their local communities, they're often able to advance a distinctive narrative. In other words, what is their ecosystem going to be known for? And of course, they need to back it up with substance. But once you're able to advance that narrative and you're able to tell that story globally as well as locally, that's when you start to get more traction. That's when you're able to demonstrate we are known for something here. We're doing something special here. If I take the United States as an example, Detroit has not historically, over the past several decades, done very well, economically speaking. And they certainly were not known as a startup ecosystem until probably a few years back. But as local ecosystem builders, including the corporations as well as others locally, have picked up steam, they've really emphasized mobility and they've really emphasized smart city type applications, which bears into which draws from the rich history of Detroit as a manufacturing hub and one that's very well known for industrial engineering. And of course, still remains the auto manufacturing capital of the United States. And so would it have been advisable for Detroit to focus on consumer applications, social media, software? Probably not quite as much. And so they picked their area of emphasis and they really went for it, leveraging the existing assets that they did have. And as a result, they've been able to gain more attention, attract more capital, and foster successful entrepreneurs.
No, thank you so much. I think that's really useful advice. And in our experience, we've been kind of trying to bridge the gap between Pakistan and Silicon Valley. Part of the reason that a lot of Pakistanis have gone out, built very large companies there. So we want to impart their learning, but we understand that it's a very unique thing that happened in Silicon Valley, and trying to replicate it might not be the best goal. I think the best is to kind of have an understanding of what your ecosystem offers, right? And for Pakistan, we think it is the amazing tech talent that we have, whether they're working in software outsourcing or starting their own startups or part of all these Silicon Valley based startups. But essentially, it is the talent that distinguishes, I think, our ecosystem. And to come to the next question, we were talking about Silicon Valley and then the other markets as well. So, in your opinion, how should startups think about international expansion?
I'll defer to Fadwa for this one. We actually just had a review of one of our international expansion programs yesterday.
Oh,
yeah. So I think international expansion comes at a different point in every startup's life cycle and really depends on where you're starting out. For example, if you're starting in the US, your total addressable market that Thomas just described is massive, right? Conquering the US can turn you into a unicorn without having to go internationally. But if you're in Singapore, if you're in Dubai, in the Emirates, your markets are much smaller. So even if you conquer your entire market, you're very quickly going to have to look outside your borders before you can go big, right? And to really scale. And so when thinking about international expansion, it's really a question of, have you conquered your own market? Have you really made addressed all of the consumers or customers that are already familiar with your product, you already have kind of a competitive advantage because you know the culture, the language, the community domestically. Because international brings with it a whole new set of challenges, right? You're looking at a new customer type that's going to have different biases and different experiences. You may be facing new competitors that are already trying to do the same thing that you're doing, but have the home court advantage. So it's really important to kind of look at why you're expanding and not expanding just to expand, because very often startups go for the kind of spread out really quickly, and then they become stretched too thin and they're encountering problems in multiple markets, and it ends up becoming, instead of a growth opportunity, it becomes something that they're very challenged by. And so I think really for founders looking at international expansion, the question is, why are you expanding and where are you expanding to? And not just going to the US because the US is a big market, or going to China because China is a giant market, right? You have to look at, why are you going to that market? Are you addressing a need that that market has that's not already addressed by a competitor? And really making sure that you're planning for that.
Yeah, and just to build on what Fadwa was saying, above all, I think it's crucial to be intentional about what you're looking for. Oftentimes for companies, as Fadwa mentioned, from small markets, you're looking for a much larger customer base. And in addition to that, you can also be looking for expertise, you can be looking for talent, you can be looking for capital. And so it's pretty crucial, I think, to look at what you yourself currently have as an organization, what your home market or what your home community has to offer, see what you can access from there, identify the gaps, and then go overseas to go get that. And of course, everyone has their personal reasons for potentially going overseas as well. I think for many founders, going to Silicon Valley is like, it's like a rite of passage for them, and it's almost like taking a pilgrimage. But for founders, I think there is a very high cost towards international exploration. It's time away from your core business. It's time away from home. Often means it's time away from your family and from your team. And so you should be very cognizant, not just of the opportunity, but also of the opportunity cost of international expansion. And so anything you do internationally should be high leverage and should be high impact for you.
So we have one related question from our community. So what are some of the international expansion programs that Fievel Startups runs?
Yeah, so we recently rolled out what we call the Global Launch Program in conjunction with the Singaporean government. And this program is designed to support founders from Singapore in going to the United States, and for founders from throughout the world in going to Singapore. We coincidentally, now that you ask, we actually are opening up applications for our programs on both sides soon. And so if you happen to be based in Singapore, or if you're looking to go to Singapore, please feel free to apply. We also anticipate rolling out similar programs throughout the world in the very near future.
Perfect. No, that sounds fantastic, and we look forward to helping support more startups get into this program, because Singapore happens to be one of the closest tech hubs that we have. I think in terms of distance, going to Silicon Valley is like a 24-hour flight. Sorry, and I think Singapore is much closer, and even in terms of time zones, right? So I'll ask my last scripted question, and then we'll get to the questions that we received from some of our network. So, what separates startup success from failure?
I think I would maybe say, I think it depends widely, right? It depends on the founder, it depends on the startup. But I think two things that I've seen in kind of with the startups that I've interacted with, the founders that I've worked with, is one, focus. Being a founder is you're wearing multiple hats, you're trying to do everything. You're the CMO, the CFO, the CEO, the COO, or maybe you have a co-founder and you've split all the C-suite in two between you. You also probably have a technical team if you're tech-based, and so you're trying to do everything. And I think one of the things we teach as part of our programs is really focusing and figuring out what is your North Star, what is the thing that's going to be most important for your organization, and then what are the things that you can do that are going to move the needle, and really looking at, okay, if revenue or partnerships or whatever it is my goal, what do I need to do to move that metric incrementally and then exponentially, right? And the other thing I would say is adaptability. I think COVID has taught us this. You never know what's going to come at you. And this was kind of a global one, but I think startup founders experience this daily, where they're faced with new challenges, problems, there's a bug, there's a partner that's upset, whatever, a customer left a bad review. So being able to very quickly adapt, to adjust, and to pivot, I think is really key to founders kind of being able to weather the storm that is kind of the first couple of months or years of starting a company.
Completely agreed. So one definition of startup that we use internally is that the startup is basically a team or even an individual where we're not sure about the customer, we're not sure about the product, we're not sure about the business model. In other words, we're not sure about really anything that makes up really what would consist of a company, or what would make up a company. So in recognizing this, the adaptability and the focus that Fadwa mentioned are absolutely crucial. And similarly, if you kind of combine the two of those things, a lot of success in running a startup is intentional experimentation. Like recognizing what you don't know yet, going out and finding the answers to that, then uncovering kind of the next question about your customers, about your product, and so forth, and then finding the answers to that one by one. I think a lot of startup founders try to do everything at once. They try to have all the answers up front. That is certainly a mistake I made when I was running my startup. And for the founders today, one reason that they can be successful is they have these systems, these processes, these methodologies for slowly uncovering, or I should say pretty rapidly uncovering actually, all the answers that they need to know to the key questions about their company. And as you answer more and more of these questions, the path becomes clear, and the path of scaling and therefore success becomes clear.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I think that's a really good point, that as a startup kind of goes along its journey, the path becomes clear, right? It's not that they have to figure out everything from day one. They just have to start and they learn on the way. I think that's the biggest learning. So I'll come to I've shortlisted 4 questions from all the DMs that I've received, and I'll just get to those, and then we'll wrap up this amazing session. So I'll start with the first one, which a lot of people have asked, and that is 500 Startups planning to open a program for Pakistani startups? Or if I can rephrase it, it would be, how can 500 startups come to Pakistan?
So as a company, 500 has been interested in Pakistan for some time. One of our main funds based in Singapore and Malaysia is actually actively looking at investment opportunities in Pakistan, and one of the investment managers there is in fact Pakistani. And so with all of that desire, we have actually been actively looking for avenues into Pakistan. Usually what is required is some form of partnership or sponsorship that allows us to resource the program appropriately. Because for us, anytime we're running a program, we want to make sure that we're providing world-class, very high-quality service to the startups participating. It requires us to be able to put people on the ground, the mentors, the program managers. And for a Pakistan program, I'd imagine there would likely be an international leg as well, whether it's into Silicon Valley, into Singapore, or other markets too. And so we want to make sure that we are able to provide the level of service that we expect ourselves to provide. So long story short, if you are aware of anyone that would make a good partner to us that can help us be on the ground, please let us know. We're very welcome and very open to hearing more about that.
Perfect. I think so. That's a task for the industry to come together and solve. And obviously, we'll actively work on this. We want more international opportunities to come to Pakistan. Another interesting question. And then looking forward to working with this. Another interesting question is, what does the name 500 Startup mean? Have you invested in 500 startups?
So this is a common question. one advantage of the 500 name is that in alphabetical lists, we appear first because, it's a number. And so it comes before any letters. But that's not the actual reason why we call ourselves 500 startups. If you look at our portfolio size, the name is actually a little bit outdated. We have now invested in more than 2,500 startups and have probably touched more than 3,000. And so we have 6x'd our name already.
The name came from actually, so remember we talked about founders wearing multiple hats. Actually there's an article, a blog post written by kind of our co-founders about 500 hats that a founder wears. And so from 500 hats, we got to 500 startups.
Yeah, it was actually originally inspired by a children's book about 500 hats. And I think one of our co-founders had young children at the time. And so that's kind of where it came from.
Wow, no, that's an interesting story. And I think the numbers are really amazing that you've already 6x to your name. So that's interesting. Another one is that, you mentioned about the SF program, but people are asking, do you have any programs that we can join in the Asian region? Kind of close to home, I think.
Yeah, certainly. So we already mentioned the global launch program in Singapore, and so for those of you looking to explore the Southeast Asia market or raise capital in Singapore, that is one very promising avenue for you. And as Fadwa mentioned earlier, we actually have applications open for our program in Japan. One thing to note about that is that it's actually a fully online program as well. While it is the fifth in our series of collaborations with the city of Kobe, is 100% virtual this year in light of the restrictions for travel and so forth around COVID. And so if you're looking for in-time zone programs or programs that are a little bit closer by than San Francisco, those are two options that you have on the table today. And we are looking forward to rolling out more in the future as well.
Perfect. So do you have any programs in the MENA region? So, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, all these.
Indeed, we do. Fadwa just got back from there, so I'll defer to her on that.
Yes, so we actually just had at the middle of May the batch 3 of our MISC 500 program demo day. It was a digital demo day and is on YouTube. You can check it out. But that was batch 3, and we're hoping soon to kind of set up batch 4, and that's based out of Riyadh. Batch 3 started in February and ended in May. So as you can imagine, we had to pivot and moved it virtually. And it's likely that if we do a batch 4 this year, it will also have virtual components and will be open to startups addressing the MENA region, looking to expand into the MENA region.
Perfect. And I asked this because, the two unicorns of the MENA region happen to be founded by Pakistan. So one is like Made in Pakistan, which is Zameen.com. And the other one is Made in Dubai, but one of the co-founders is Pakistani. So we take pride in Kareem as well. And I think we share a lot of similarities with the markets in the MENA region, right? Especially Egypt and maybe Saudi Arabia as well. And I think that would be a great opportunity for our startups as well. So I'll come to my last. Yeah, sure.
No, I was just agreeing. Definitely, that's a very good fit.
Yeah. So I'll come to my last question from the community, which is, if my startup is looking to solve a local problem, would I still have a chance to get into the 500 startups program in San Francisco or others?
So we will never say no up front. I think it depends how big that local problem is. So as ours, as you've mentioned, Pakistan is actually a huge market with 200 million people. I would also say that a lot of the programs you think are local may actually be present elsewhere as well. And so different markets across the world in different cities often have similar challenges. And so the problem that you're solving locally may actually be scalably globally. And so that's something to consider as well.
And I think that's also one area maybe where 500 startups can help. It's if a startup is doing really well in solving this very big problem inside Pakistan, and then they don't have exposure to these other markets or other countries where the problem may be. I think that's also one benefit of kind of applying to these programs, that even if you don't get in, you get these insights and you get these can always come back and apply again, right?
Certainly, yes.
Perfect. So this happened to be the last question, and I think we still have 10 minutes. I'll just take this one comment here, which is I'm member of an incubation center in Pakistan, and most of the projects that I see are not ready to be scaled, but kind of stuck in between stages. What do you recommend? If you can give an answer to this.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the answer is going to depend on why you believe they're getting stuck. If we think about the very early stages of a startup, you're trying to accomplish a few things. First, you want to make sure you have a product prototype, and you also need to understand the customer and what their pains are, and crucially, what they're willing to pay for. And once you have sort of the match between not necessarily the product and the market, but at least between the problem and the solution, then it becomes easier to iterate and test continuously until you reach something that people are going to buy more easily than they would otherwise. Generally speaking, if it feels like you're pulling teeth when you're trying to sell, you probably don't have problem solution fit, or you probably don't have market product fit. And so without additional context as to why they're getting stuck, my guess would be that they would probably benefit from really iterating on these 2 points, tweaking the product, or maybe taking a step back to understand the customer at greater depth using various data sources in order to identify what needs to be changed to fit the market, or in other words, to fit the customer specifically.
Perfect. No, I think you answered the question very well. So with this, I'd like to thank the audience for sticking around with us, and to the people who are listening to the recording later. And thanks to Thomas and Fadwa for giving us all the time, and again supporting Pakistan, I would say. And we look forward to maybe sooner rather than later bringing 500 startups to Pakistan as well.
We look forward to it. It's been a
Thank you for
pleasure.
having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.